my 18th birthday, it happened to be the church youth group sleepover. I was home with my boyfriend and my family, and before heading out we were having dinner and watching my favourite Disney film, Beauty and the Beast, the animated version. And something to note about me is that I have a terrible reputation with mobile phones. I'm always about 5 years at least behind the times, so I am a brick phone, pay-as-you-go kind of person, which meant that at this time in my life, my iPad mini was my absolute treasure. So as I sat down cross-legged on the sofa, ready to watch the film, my knee clipped my iPad, which was resting on the arm of the sofa, and instead of it flipping down into my lap, it completely cracked the screen. This meant that we were an hour late for the sleepover because I was so busy crying. And this might sound dramatic, but only 4 days beforehand, I had paid £80 to get the previous crack fixed. And from then on, my iPad slowly died. I got no refund, no compensation, so it really was the best birthday ever. Now I wonder if you've ever worked so hard for something or longed for something so much and then had it ripped away so prematurely. Well, in the Bible, Abraham and Sarah once received what they had waited so long for. In Genesis chapter 17, God makes a covenant or a promise with Abraham that he will be the father of many nations, and his wife Sarah would finally conceive a child. Now, luckily for me, I only waited a few months after my birthday to bite the bullet and just buy a new iPad. But Abraham and Sarah didn't have such control. In fact, Abraham was 99 and Sarah was 90 at this point. What a long time to wait for a child. So long that they must have been hopeless. So long that Abraham even questioned God on it. He laughed. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? Now let's jump ahead to Genesis 22 when Isaac is born. Abraham and Sarah now have a son and God's promise has been fulfilled. And that word laughter has now been used again, but in a kind of secure disbelief way. Before, Abraham just couldn't believe that this was going to happen. Now, Sarah's looking in retrospect, being secure that it has happened, she does have a son, but still in disbelief about it. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." She added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." Now, the story so far might sound really happy, laughably happy. Abraham and Sarah have waited so long for a baby, and now Isaac has been born. This is great news, right? This is the end to a really happy story. Except it's about to take a turn. God called, "Abraham," and he replied, "Here I am. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." What? What is God thinking? He's meant to be providing descendants. He promised. God never breaks promises, right? How could he be so cruel? So early the next morning, Abraham, Isaac, and 2 servants went up to the mountain to worship. At least Abraham told that to the servants anyway, while he continued ahead with Isaac alone. But it's true, they were going to worship God. Worship is an expression of adoration. So how much must he adore God to not even question sacrificing his son? Abraham was willingly going to give up control, obey God, and surrender his beloved one and only son, all because he wants to worship God. Now, to put the next bit of speech into modern day translation. Dad? Yes? The fire and wood are here, but where's the lamb for the sacrifice? God's already got one in mind, son. I wonder at what point Isaac realised the sacrifice was going to be him. Was it at this moment? Was it when Abraham built the altar? Or when Abraham bound Isaac, laid him on the wood and drew his knife? But again, we're met with the words, "Here I am." When God called to Abraham before, he was willing, ready and available to God. Here I am. And even now, at the peak of it all, about to sacrifice the son he loves to the God he loves more, here I am, still ready, still trusting, still available. Now the good news is this is a test and Abraham has passed. Abraham showed that he feared or respected God through his willingness to choose God over anything, even his long-awaited son. And God intervened so that the sacrifice was never carried out. So is this all good now? Is this the happy ending that we're all hoping for? That there's nothing bad to come, right? Right? It's not foreshadowing something more tragic, right? Well, this story is a prophecy. It's a hint at something to come. Only the sacrifice to come is carried out. Do we know what that sacrifice was? Perhaps the words here, one and only son, ring a bell. John 3:16, the most famous verse in the Bible. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, so that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. Now God knew all this time that his son Jesus would be born to be sacrificed, but God didn't need to test himself for respect like he tested Abraham. Jesus was God. Jesus was without sin. Jesus didn't need to prove his love for God the Father. And in this instance with Abraham and Isaac, God the Father calls down to Abraham to stop the sacrifice. But on the cross, when Jesus is dying, there isn't a voice from the sky saying stop. Instead it goes dark. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. When Abraham was holding the knife over his beloved Isaac, I wonder if God was thinking about one day watching Jesus being killed. How one day he must choose to sacrifice his son Jesus to save us from our sin. That in order to save us, Jesus had to die. Jesus had to be sacrificed, his one and only son. Earlier we saw in Genesis chapter 17, God promises Abraham he'd have many descendants, generations of descendants through a son. However, God also promises this before in Genesis 15, and in Genesis 16, Sarai, her name before Sarah, persuades Abram, his name before Abraham, to try it their way. Sarah was unconvinced by God, and her desire for a child took over, so she created a plan. She sought out control, and Abraham had a son called Ishmael through Sarah's slave Hagar. And in chapter 17, when God again reveals his covenant with Abraham, after he laughs in disbelief about his age, he suggests to God that Ishmael should be the heir of the descendants. If only Ishmael might live under your blessing. He tried to fit God's plan into his own circumstances. God's plan under my order. Abraham and Sarai had to learn that they can't control God's way through their own means. God chose Isaac. Thankfully, Abraham showed he understood that when he led Isaac to be sacrificed. He gave up control completely, followed God's instructions wholly, and Isaac was saved because of his faith. Now similarly, if Jesus had control, perhaps he would have done things to suit himself better. He knew the pain and the humiliation of crucifixion. At the Mount of Olives, before his arrest, he prayed to God, kneeling, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me." To put it into modern words, don't let this happen to me. Find another way. But in the same breath he continues, "Yet not my will, but yours be done." He had an honest relationship with God the Father. He shares his emotions and desires of his heart, but he always honours God with trust and control over all. Well, although this may seem tragic and heartbreaking, this is actually a good thing. This is the good ending to the story. Because although God knows grief through Jesus' death, he also knows victory through Jesus' resurrection, love over sin, and hope in heaven. God only does what is good, even when we don't see it. Despite the grief of Jesus' sacrifice, God had so much love for us, and he knew it was good and glorifying. Because he knew that was the way he could restore his relationship with you and me. That was the way to conquer death, the payment for our wrongdoings. That was the way to conquer eternal separation. Now, as we're learning about the Bible, it's always good to reflect on our own lives personally and see what kind of links we can make to help us learn something. And as I was thinking about this to try and find an example in my life, a time when a painful sacrifice has been made in order to rebuild to something good, something better, I actually couldn't think of anything in the past, but I could think of something in the future, and that's therapy. I haven't been before. I'm nervous about it, but I know that I need to. I know that I need professional help for the emotional baggage that I'm carrying. And I think that that could be a sacrifice of a low functioning emotional system to chaos, to destruction, to pain and stress, but with a means to restart for a hopeful, well functioning future. Sometimes things get worse before they get better. Sometimes things hurt more before we reach peace. Sometimes we have to become extremely uncomfortable or scared to overcome a challenge. And maybe you feel that way with friends, family, hopes, desires, school, partners, mental health, the past. But we know God is powerful and good, and he knows pain. So let's be like Jesus. Let's be honest and trusting towards God. And let's be like Abraham and know that it's okay not to get it right all the time, because we can learn and grow and get it right next time. So speaking of growing, let's conclude with a couple of reflection questions. Firstly, what's our response when God calls us? God calls us into a relationship with him, to deny ourselves and live for him and share his love with others. So are we ready? Are we all in? Is your response, "Here I am"? Secondly, are we willing to give up, to sacrifice our greatest desires? Our hopes, dreams, possessions, the things we've waited for, cried over, laughed in disbelief about? Do we love God more? And thirdly, have we given God total control? God equips us with his Holy Spirit, with wisdom and discernment to make decisions and understand things. Are we using that? Are we trusting in God's knowledge and judgment? Are we prepared to be a follower of Jesus and not a competitive leader? Well guys, I'm going to leave you with those thoughts. Thank you for joining along with today's Bible study, preach. Hope you like this style of doing things, and I'll see you again in another video very soon. Bye.